again. Thanks again, Tanya, Lisa, the whole team. Like I said, great partners here at MediaPost. Yeah, I'm Joe Kyriakoza. I run part of the business at S&P Global Mobility called Polk Automotive Solutions. We just completed a merger. We were once known as IHS Markit, and now we are part of S&P Global. The Polk data and everything that you know about us will continue to be a staple in the industry and the trusted brand that you know and love, hopefully. So yeah, we haven't changed. We're part of a bigger organization now, and it's a good thing because there's opportunities to grow and invest in the business in ways that we hadn't thought about before. So that's exciting, and we're really committed to continuing to provide the invaluable insights and the unmatched data assets that we've brought to bear for so many years. And the goal is helping marketers just make better decisions that shape the business. And really, like, what we're really trying to do is help marketers just make stronger connections with their current customers and their future customers with better data and better information about them. So it's what we do. It's what we do every day, and we look forward to working with everybody on that. Enough about me, enough about us. I'm excited to introduce our speakers here. And we'll start with Mike Wall here to my left. Mike is our Executive Director of Automotive Analysis, and Mike's gonna walk us through, one of the most important elements, one of the most important topics of conversation that is in this industry right now, which is this inventory shortage, this chip shortage, and the supply chain effects, and how how some of the changes that continue to happen, and as he'll probably say, as he said to me many times, it's just like there's no normal anymore, and we continue to have to kind of revise our forecasts and look at the future in ways that doesn't feel like we have a crystal ball anymore, because it's just so different and ever changing. So Mike will talk about how all these things are affecting the recovery timeline for this industry and for the brands that have been on stage that are here representing. And then Adam's going to then follow up with talking about the impacts of this inventory challenge on a very important piece of what a marketer is trying to do is maintain brand loyalty. So brand loyalty is super important, and during times of crisis and during times of challenge for markets, brand loyalty tends to erode, and we lose customers because they're not getting what they want. So Adam's going to talk a little bit more about that and some of the real different behavior changes that we've started to see for automotive buyers and the implications of that to the OEMs and the dealers and the end consumer especially, right? So excited to have these guys start. Mike, I will pass it over to you, and thank you all again for joining and listening. Appreciate it.
All right, thanks so much, Joe. Appreciate it. I apologize for the tie. I just came from across town at a banking conference. I got to head back out later, so better to tie it once or I really have problems. Yeah, appreciate the opportunity to present to everybody, and let's kick it off because Joe touched on it well. There are a lot of dropping shoes in this industry. Just when we think we've got it figured out, I was remarking earlier to somebody, I was in Vegas in February. Things are opening up for us, more travel and presenting, and it was at that time we had a trucker strike blocking the U.S.-Canadian border. Incredibly impactful to automotive. I did not have that on my bingo card coming into this year of all of the other things that were impacting us in the industry. So that's an indication of what we've been wrestling with. Obviously, the most significant as of late is the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Late February comes around. We update our forecast on a monthly basis. I work closely with our forecasting team, so vehicle sales, production, powertrain trends, that sort of thing. It's underpinned. How we forecast is very much top-down and bottom-up. We start at the top looking at those macroeconomic drivers that inform consumer demand, industrial production, economic development. We build up model by model, plant by plant. And one of our drivers is economic growth, as you can imagine. So GDP, the old standard here. And you can look at, last year we, as a world, but also from a region, from the U.S. market, We're in recovery mode. We had a lot of stimulus pumping through the system. We posted some pretty solid gains. Coming into this year, we were expecting a cooling off to some extent. Global growth pre-Russia invasion was probably closer to 3.7, 3.8. About the same for the US. Well, the Russian invasion came in, obviously incredibly impactful. Obviously the human toll goes without saying, should be said, but there's also the economic toll, obviously, to broader Europe, but also the world, really. We think about oil prices, we think about commodity prices and how that's translating, and there is a slowing effect that we're seeing in terms of economic development. So all of those certainly do play a role. It is impacting pent-up demand. I'll get into that in a moment because that's critical for folks in this audience. It's also critical globally as well because that's where we are seeing demand also being influenced there as well. So when we think about production, I'm a big fan of production. I'm a production forecaster. I got my start in that. You know, and when we think about production, in the old days, like pre-COVID, demand informed production. You know, you're not going to, ideally, you don't want to build a vehicle before you get the demand. That generally, obviously, you got inventory in there as well. Flash forward to now, production is informing demand, hands down. We've heard about it. Everybody's heard about it, the lack of inventory out there. So when we look at production, this is our latest global production forecast, just as a straight line chart. And you've got a couple bound lines in there. The blue and the red really represent our estimates for analog chip capacity. I'm going to be talking about semiconductors for just a bit here because it is still the name of the game in automotive, especially here in North America and US. Obviously in Europe, you've got Russia, Ukraine, you hear talk about wire harnesses and things like that. Absolutely very relevant. Here, it's still semiconductors. So here we go, as we go out towards the end of 2023 and into 2024, we still are going to bump our head against sort of some implicit capacity constraints, even as it relates to analog chips. When I talk about analog chips, they tend to be the lower tech type stuff. We got a lot of those in cars. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of really high-tech cool stuff upstairs at the show, but there's a lot of analog chips that are in those vehicles as well. So keep an eye on analog chips when we think about that. So I throw that in there just for some context. Let's talk about semiconductors maybe a little bit more. And again, this isn't meant to, I'm not the semiconductor guy within the firm. We've got a number of analysts that cover it. I've had to get kind of a crash course in it. And I want to try to hopefully illuminate at least some of the concerns on that front. When we use semiconductor as a term, I think one of the things we catch ourselves in is we're using it ubiquitously. The term chip, the term semiconductor, it couldn't be more complex. Again, I've alluded to some of that analog versus maybe some of the advanced process nodes and the microcontrollers. Some of the processes, there's a front-end process of actually creating the wafer. There's the back-end process of the assembly, testing, and packaging. We've got regional nuances and even automaker-specific nuances in terms of how they're sourcing. So incredibly important. Number of chips per car, I've got a slide here in a moment I'll show you, it's off the charts. So when we think about what's driving this constraint, it's not just consumer electronics, although that is a big challenge in terms of sucking the semiconductor demand. It's also the number of chips per car. Mismatch of production and demand, we've been living that. Every automaker and every tier one supplier is saying, give us all the chips you can make. The chip manufacturers are saying, that sounds great right now until you have all the chips you want, then we're out of luck and we've got a lot of excess capacity potentially. So we've got to get to a better match between demand and supply on that front. Capacity for chip fabrication, again, this is where that nuances between analog and advanced controllers really does matter because most of the investments going into the advanced process, what are called advanced process nodes, like 88% of that investment, 12% is going into analog chips. And again, as I alluded to earlier, we use a lot of analog chips. So again, there's some mismatches we have to still keep an eye on. And then allocation of chip fabrication capacity. Again, we're doing battle with consumer electronics, industrial products, and really other sources as well. This is that slide I wanted to highlight in terms of chips per vehicle. And again, there isn't a scale here because this is it's a rough sort of rudimentary estimate on the part of our chip analysts, our semiconductor team. They're some of the best in the business, and they've had to, it's incredibly difficult to try to determine the number of chips per vehicle and the progression, if you will. But one of the things that we've gotten frustrated by is in 2019, we produced 94 million vehicles. Why in 2021 could we only produce 74 million? Well, this is one of the contributing factors. Again, there were other factors as well. You've got, again, consumer demand for consumer products and that sort of thing. number of chips per vehicle is really kind of going parabolic right now. And it's going to keep progressing at a pretty rapid clip because of, again, we just have to go upstairs. We see the EV activity, the new and innovative center stacks in these vehicles, the instrument clusters, all of those are certainly driving that. Quick slide on powertrain. Obviously, EVs are a big theme, rightfully so. And this gives you a kind of a glimpse and a snapshot where we look at North American calendar year 2020 versus 2030. Pretty profound change. That kind of reddish color, purplish red color, 3% in 2020, growing to 32% by 2030. And I dare say there's probably even some further upside to that. We're seeing it every day. There's more deployment. I'll get into that in a moment. More deployment of new models coming. We're seeing more government incentives and encouragement. We haven't seen a full rendition of maybe an incentive suite around that. We're going to be watching for that, but certainly more investment in charging infrastructure. And we're seeing increasingly automakers obviously placing their bets too in terms of the vehicles they're looking to launch. So that's driving a lot of this as well. So we have, there is a path to get there, but by the same token, we got a fair amount of work to do too, whether it be charging infrastructure, educating the consumer, again, further battery development, strides that we see there, a lot of investment on that front still going on. Quick note on battery electric vehicle model counts. This looks at U.S. light vehicle sales in a given year, the model count. Again, 2022 to 2030, it's going off the charts. Again, for folks, I work with all of our various client sets, suppliers, automakers, financial firms, obviously on the media side as well. And the suppliers, this freaks them out a little bit because it is the potential to really kind of saturate their book of business, if you will, and kind of knock that average volume per nameplate down. Folks in this room, opportunity abounds here, creating brand stories, creating recognition and a following for these models. So there's an incredibly exciting time. And again, we only have to take a stroll upstairs and hopefully in successive future auto shows as well as we kind of re-embrace going full scale in person. We're going to see more and more of that. There's a lot more products coming down the pike. Quick note on light vehicle sales. So again, before I turn it over to Adam, what I tried to do here is I looked at our January 2020 light vehicle sales forecast, going way back in the old date books, pre-COVID, because we're getting a lot of questions on what does pent-up demand look like, how might that kind of materialize as we emerge out of this, whether call it the COVID side or even the supply chain pressure side. But I overlaid our latest March forecast. This year we're forecasting 15.2 million units, U.S. light vehicle sales. Again, it's going to largely be predicated on volume of vehicles that are available. We're hopeful for that, but by the same token, it might be a lift. But also looking beyond that, going into next year and the following year, we do start to recover some of those units. Now, what we have to caution on, and it's something that we're seeing every day, obviously inflation. We're seeing some of the pressures on the macroeconomic front. Those can have some limiting effects, to be sure. But we do see a return to 16.5, dare I see even getting close to 17 million units. I think we have certainly that opportunity within the industry. And then it really comes down to really kind of dissecting that book of business, if you will, and looking into plumbing the depths, looking into loyalty, because we have seen deterioration in some areas. And if you can't get the car, we're seeing consumers going used. We're seeing consumers looking at other brands, other segments even. There's a lot of variability right now based on what we're seeing because of that lack of availability. It's coming. We'll start to right that ship. But once we do, now we have to know where to go beyond that. So with that, I will turn it over to Adam, and he can take it from there.
Thanks, Mike. I'll start with a quick personal story about my own supply chain pain, per se. So my wife and I just welcomed a baby about 2 months ago now, and like all new parents in the room, you'll understand this, very tired, sleepless nights. We came home with 2 bottles, and we kept cleaning the same 2 bottles over and over and over again, 8 to 10, 12 times a day. And at a point, I realized, okay, I need to get more bottles. My wife wanted a very specific, ergonomic, perfect bottle. I go online, and there's a 2-month back order. So we're stuck with a decision to make. Am I going to keep cleaning the same 2 bottles every single day, 8 to 10 times a day, and not sleep, or are we going to find another brand? And so rather than keep servicing those bottles, a little bad auto pun there, we decided to move on to something else. And so we're seeing a lot of the same right now with the auto industry. I think oftentimes, sometimes like you hear in sports, the best ability is availability. And so that's sort of what we're seeing right now. And automakers and marketers need to understand how to adapt to this environment and potentially be opportunistic. And that's what we'll talk a little bit more about. So, with that, loyalties dropped about 2%, comparing December 2020 and December 2021. And what does that mean? More nomads in market, sort of this fickle group that's less loyal to their individual brand. So what do we do about that? SUV is a continued winner, continuing to grow in loyalty, grow in market share. So that is increasing, but also at the detriment of all other body styles, it seems. Luxury also continues to grow in share and also in competition. Currently we're looking at 16 models growing to 20 models, which is sort of now starting to rival mainstream when it comes to model development. That's going to present interesting scenarios when it comes to competition within that space and how it affects loyalty. And finally, EV obviously is continuing to grow and expand. Currently a fertile ground for loyalty gains, and we imagine it'll continue to grow as well in share and in loyalty to the segment. So let's talk a little bit more about the loyalty impact of the first year of the constrained market. So if you think about the way that we segment all shoppers or all current car owners, when it comes to loyalty, we look at loyalists, super loyalists, and nomads. That nomads, again, being that fickle group less loyal to any specific brand. And what we found looking at the years preceding 2021 compared to 2021 is that they're remarkably consistent. The numbers haven't changed much, but something to point out is that the super loyal share from 2018 to 2020 grew by 12%. So everyone's doing a great job in this room investing in data strategy and marketing. But on the other side of that is there was actually more shoppers returning to market in 2021. About another 270,000 shoppers returned to market. Of that group, 67% were nomads. And you also see the super loyal share drop fairly significantly. So while it's a small sample size, it's a bellwether for what's happening and what's coming. Marketers need to be aware of these changes as they happen, and obviously inventory constraints play into this, and there's certainly factors that we need to be aware of. But I think, again, there's an opportunity to be successful in this constrained environment. So we talked about SUVs earlier. Currently, dominating the market, continuing to grow in loyalty year over year, actually so much so that with the decline of all other body styles, we're still seeing a general increase in loyalty trends across body styles, just based on the SUVs alone. So reaching a record of 72% loyalty in 2021, which is 17 points above the industry average. Also, we touched on this earlier, but luxury is continuing to grow in model development and also conquesting from mainstream. So right now we're seeing luxury conquest at 1.5 times ratio to the mainstream market. Amazingly, Tesla's conquesting at 7x. We see Genesis conquesting at 5x. So there's some brands that are doing particularly well in this area. And by 2029, we expect to see nearly 1 out of every 5 vehicles will be a luxury product. So more opportunity in the luxury space, a growing market, more models, but then also more competition between these models. So being aware of how that's going to impact loyalty is going to be incredibly important. So got to touch on EV, of course. When we look at EV sentiment, we're looking here at EV loyalty scores above 55%. Currently, there are 18 states that sit above 55%. So I'm going to put a question out to the audience. What do you think are the 2 states that are sitting at 54%? Anybody want to take a guess? I'll pick on someone from my team. Kaufman, what do you think? Michigan? North Dakota? Okay, it's Pennsylvania and Iowa. So interestingly enough, we're seeing some fairly obvious trends, I think, when you look at the West Coast and their dominance in the EV market. Currently, 40% of the EV market sits on the West Coast, right? And the Southeast is becoming a really hot spot. We're seeing a lot of infrastructure development and regulation up in the Northeast as well. That's impacting this EV loyalty and obviously EV adoption. But it's going to be interesting to see the next areas and regions that start to populate in terms of loyalty and adoption of EVs. Continuing on EV, probably not a surprise to anybody in this room, hybrid and EV market share is continuing to grow fairly exponentially. I mean, Mike touched on this. By 2030, it looks like it's about to be a third of the pie. It's pretty amazing compared to where it is today. And gasoline's falling to a new low, still obviously the dominant fuel type in market. But it's also going to be interesting to see how some of these macroeconomic factors, like what we're seeing in Ukraine, are going to start to impact some of this potentially quicker adoption of hybrids and EVs. So wrapping up, some short-term obstacles that we're dealing with, the chip shortage. More long-term, things like geopolitics, inflation, so economic issues, behavioral changes, sustainability, climate change. All of these things are going to have an impact on the loyalty to specific brands. I think a really interesting, case study was the Volkswagen Buzz. That's a great example of talking to that next generation of buyers and what they might be interested in, and how that builds a brand halo to selling, other vehicles in market. So like the ID4. So I think, what we're going to continue to see is there are obviously challenges that we're dealing with in market, but certainly opportunities. So when it comes to the opportunity in marketing, you need to follow the shopper, right? Expand your geography outside of your typical comfort zone. People are now more prone to buy online, to order in advance. Maybe they want, at-home delivery. These are things that make a difference to the consumer, and the ease of buying is going to become incredibly important. So expanding your geography, conquesting against your inflow and outflow when it comes to loyalty, really digging into your data strategy will continue to be incredibly important. So working with partners that understand the data and then sort of expanding that data strategy and then contracting it once you're finding performance is going to become more important. And then on the other side of it, of course, you need to measure everything. The more models grow and proliferate across EV and hybrid, the more important it is to understand what's performing, what's having that brand halo effect, like we talked about with Volkswagen, and just continuing to adapt that strategy. And so marketers are doing it now, and it's just going to continue to accelerate over time with more models in market as this big sort of geometric shift starts to occur. I think with that, loyalty goes from being a challenge to being an opportunity if you can find the right customers now who might be interested in your brand, bring them into the fold, generate that lifetime value that Joe was talking about earlier. That becomes a tremendous opportunity. So that's what we have for now, and I'm happy to take some questions.